Why have so many political assassinations occurred in Africa? The simple answer is to prevent African countries from becoming self-determined. Colonial and neo-colonial powers have historically exploited Africa's vast mineral and natural resources, finding it easier when the continent remains weak, unstable and disunited. This is precisely why they have often sought to undermine the Pan-African ideal. They favor catastrophes, civil wars, conflicts and corrupt leaders over a strong and united Africa because exploitation is simpler that way. Consequently, many African leaders who attempted to enact measures perceived as threatening by the West, specifically policies aimed at achieving economic independence from the West and promoting a pan-African agenda, have faced resistance and been assassinated by Western powers. These targeted killings didn't just occur during the struggles for independence, they continued post-independency as a means to maintain influence over the former colonies. So even after gaining independence, African nations have contended with economic regulations as a form of neo-colonialism. As you will probably agree, African nations deserve full economic independence and the freedom to utilize their natural resources for their own benefit, not for the benefit of neo-colonial powers. In my last video about 10 assassinated African leaders, I listed the most notable cases of political assassinations by Western hands, like Thomas Sankara, Amilcar Cabral, Patrice Lumumba, Muammar Gaddhafi, and sadly there are even more cases like this, so here's a part 2. This time I will also include leaders who were targeted due to internal political rivalry or ethnic reasons. As previously mentioned, any form of catastrophe or conflict that does not threaten the neo-colonial agenda is often overlooked or even welcomed by Western powers. It seems they prefer to see internal divisions persist. Let them slay each other, but don't touch our cobalt. We need this for our batteries. So let's just start with the first African president to be assassinated. Sylvanus Olympio. Born in Lomé in 1902 during German colonization and educated at the London School of Economics, Sylvanus Olympio was multilingual, fluent in German, English, French, Portuguese and Yoruba. He worked for a long time with the Anglo-Dutch company Unilever. Until 1960, he was a symbol of the multicultural nation that France had been unable to colonize in its usual manner. Between 1919 and 1960, the League of Nations and later the United Nations had entrusted France with the guardianship of Togo. Just after achieving independence in May 1960, Togo's first president told Agence France-Presse, "I will do my best to ensure my country can thrive without France." France's plan was to impose a continuous neo-colonial influence on its former colonies even after their official independence, primarily through economic dependency. You guessed it, I'm talking about the CFA franc. Just a brief overview of the CFA franc. The Communauté Financière Africaine franc is a currency that France has mandated for 14 African nations, including Togo, Guinea and other colonies, to adopt as their official legal tender. Introduced in 1945 when the US dollar became the world's new reserve currency, thereby devaluing the French franc, France established the CFA franc. It was pegged at a fixed exchange rate to the French franc, serving as a proxy hedge. This arrangement requires CFA nations to deposit 50% of their foreign exchange reserves in the French treasury, effectively reducing their control over half of their financial assets. Additionally, the CFA franc has been subject to a significant devaluation against the French franc, enhancing French purchasing power in these African countries. This economic dependence has been a long-standing issue, one that the military governments in Mali, Niger and Burkina Faso are currently contesting. For example, France always bought uranium from Niger below market value, and now they want to stop this form of exploitation. So, coming back to Togo, Sylvanus Olympio, who became president in 1958, wanted to leave the franc zone, instituting a central bank of Togo and creating an independent Togolese currency backed by, interestingly enough, the Deutsche Bank. Togo, through its balancing policy, risked offering a model of emancipation to all former French colonies. For Dogo and Foucart, his advisor on African affairs, Olympio was the prototype of the surreptitiously anti-French head of state and needed to be eliminated immediately. In this regard, Olympio was more dangerous than Ahmed Sékou Touré, and Dogo never wanted to be so humiliated again, as he was when Touré decided that Guinea would not be a part of the neo-colonial project of the French community. Before Olympio could finish implementing the Togolese currency, French-trained Togolese soldiers assassinated him in the night of the 12th January 1963, and Togo's new French-backed dictator kept the country in the CFA system under a de facto French regime. Foucart would later say, "Sylvanus Olympio was not one of our friends. With him, my relations were never as cordial as those I had with Nicolas Grunetsky, the man who succeeded him after the coup. For the first time since independence, an African president had been shot, and Sylvanus Olympio was surely not the last one." Let's stay in this era when the colonized African countries gained their independence. We just move from Togo to the Central African Republic. Barthélemy Boganda is probably a lesser-known name, which is definitely a shame, because he was, to quote historian Gérard Prunier, probably the most gifted and most inventive of French Africa's decolonization generation of politicians. In Ubangui-Chari, which was part of French Equatorial Africa, Boganda became the first black priest after his parents were killed in colonial violence, and the church took him in and later encouraged him to pursue a career in politics. In 1945, Boganda was elected to the French National Assembly and arrived in Paris, where he was assigned a secretary. They soon fell in love, married and had 3 children. What followed was a media campaign against him, because now he was a defrocked Catholic priest. He stood his ground and quit the party of the Popular Republican Movement. For him, that was the opportunity to create his own party, Messan, the movement for the social evolution of Black Africa. It was founded on the premise of equality and sought to end exploitation by colonial settlers. When de Gaulle visited the French colonies to get their support for the French Community Project, he was welcomed in Brazzaville by Barthélemy Boganda, who was initially not in favor of the French community, fearing it would forestall independence. But de Gaulle assured him that Ubangui-Chari's membership in the community would not preclude it from securing independence at a later time. Boganda was an intelligent, wise and thoughtful man. He wished for independence, but he was worried in breaking immediate ties with France, his people might lose all the relevant supplies and know-how they would need to survive in the first phase of independence. We all know how de Gaulle punished Guinea when Sékou Touré went for immediate decolonization. So Boganda traveled around Ubangui-Chari to tell the people that the French would remain slightly longer, to set right the ravages of colonization. After all, his biggest dream was to create a United States of Latin Africa, a federation between the Romance language-speaking countries of Central Africa. Boganda was then very disappointed when Félix Houphouët-Boigny became a minister of the French government in 1958, because he was someone who would destroy all the Pan-African projects, and he sought the balkanization of Africa. However, at the end, Boganda would still side with Général de Gaulle while questioning him about his country's future.
Nous sommes convaincus que vous êtes venus aujourd'hui pour achever l'œuvre entreprise à la conférence de Brazzaville et consacrer définitivement par un engagement solennel une AES en marche vers son indépendance, mais toujours unie à la France indépendante et immortelle. Aujourd'hui, comme en 1940, c'est de vous que nous attendons le salut. Aujourd'hui, comme en 1940, l'AEF a hâte d'entendre votre voix. Parlez, Monsieur le Président, parlez sans équivoque. Nous répondrons de même le 18 septembre. Vive de Gaulle, vive la République!
All the other territories had decided to join the French community as separate entities, though. Deeply crushed in his dream of a Latin African federation, Boganda resigned himself to proclaiming only Ubangui-Chari as the Central African Republic. Boganda was poised to become the first president of the independent CAR when he boarded a plane to Bangui on the 29th March 1959, just prior to legislative elections. But he should never arrive. His plane crashed and it took 2 days to find the wreckage. There were no survivors. The investigations were less than thorough, and there were rumors around a possible assassination, as investigators apparently found traces of explosives in the wreckage. Boganda was a less radical figure with a soft-spoken manner, so why assassinating him? Maybe these virtues were exactly what made him so dangerous. He was probably the most capable politician of that time, with the actual ability to make his dream of real independence from France come true. And as Prunier wrote, the probability of foul play was very high. The whites, who worked for what was left of the Grande Compagnie Concessionnaire, hated Boganda, who had been instrumental in finally getting compulsory labor outlawed in 1946. They also hated his intelligence, which was unsettling to their view of black inferiority. Assassination or not, his death had dramatic consequences. As he was a great leader and politician, there were not many qualified people to succeed him. Shortly after his death, his country gained official independence, but the Central African Republic was orphaned as it was being born. Barthélemy Boganda was not the only one to miss his country becoming independent. Eduardo Mondlane also didn't live to see a free Mozambique. Eduardo Chivambo Mondlane was born in 1920 in Manjakatse in southern Mozambique. He worked as a shepherd until he was around 10 years old, and he was so smart smart and ambitious that after attending school he studied anthropology and sociology in South Africa and Portugal, which was quite exceptional for that time and his background. While studying, he met Amilcar Cabral of Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde and Angola's Agostinho Neto. All of them came from countries colonized by Portugal, and they joined their intellectual forces in their struggle for independence. After finishing his studies and his PhD in the US, Mondlane worked as a professor for history and sociology, and as such he got approached by the Portuguese fascist regime around Antonio de Oliveira Salazar, who wanted him to join their side and help them to control their African colonies. Mondlane, a man of principles and incorruptible, politely resigned and joined instead the independence movement. Mondlane was one of those scholar activists, someone who belonged to the world of academia and research, a thinker and book lover. However, by dismissing Salazar's offer, he not only said goodbye to a prestigious position, but also to his secure and comfortable life. The freedom of the African countries suffering under Portuguese rule was more important to him, and they actually needed him. There were multiple fragmented independence movements, and they needed unification, organization, and a credible leader. After moving to Tanzania in 1962, Dr. Eduardo Mondlane was to become the president of the newly formed Front for the Liberation of Mozambique, or FRELIMO. Supported by Tanzania's Julius Nyerere and financed by Western forces as by the USSR, FRELIMO set up the headquarters in Dar es Salaam. Mondlane, being a gentle and cultivated bookworm, was probably not a typical guerrilla fighter. He knew, though, how to play his cards on the international banquet. He once said, "I get weapons from the East and money from the West." Soon, people around him started to be targeted and assassinated, and Mondlane was very much aware that he was marked for death by the infamous Portuguese Secret Service, PIDE. They probably did their homework and knew how to get to him, so they sent the book lover Mondlane a package containing a book. On the 3rd February 1969, while opening the book, it exploded and killed him immediately. After his death, FRELIMO struggled to replace him as a leader till Samora Machel took over the role of his former mentor. Samora's famous saying, "A luta continua," originally comes from Mondlane, and in memory of him, it became the motto of Machel's life and a never-ending struggle for freedom and peace. After Mondlane's death, his dream came true and Mozambique gained independence under Samora Machel's leadership in 1975. The country from then on fought in solidarity with their brothers and sisters living under foreign oppressive rule and supported especially the struggle against the apartheid regimes in Rhodesia and South Africa. Many anti-apartheid fighters were living in exile in Mozambique, like Ruth First. But even though she was working in Maputo, she was not out of reach of her enemies. Ruth First, born in Johannesburg in 1925, was the daughter of two Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe to South Africa. First was abducted to radical politics early. Her parents, Matilda and Julius, were founding members of the South African Communist Party, the SACP, which would go on to become a major part of the anti-apartheid coalition together with the African National Congress. At the University of Witwatersrand, she was involved in the Federation of Progressive Students, where she met the young Nelson Mandela and Eduardo Mondlane. And after graduating, she continued to agitate against white supremacy. She helped form the South African Congress of Democrats to mobilize and organize support for the ANC. First also worked as a journalist at left-wing papers in South Africa, such as The Guardian, where she investigated and exposed the violence and brutality of the apartheid system. Probably because of this exposure, the newspaper was soon banned by the state. Her marriage to the fellow anti-apartheid activist Joe Slovo in 1949 sealed her fate as an enemy of the brutal white regime. Although both white themselves, Ruth and Joe dedicated all their time and resources to fighting color discrimination in the country. After the Afrikaner National Party was elected by the white minority electorate 1 year earlier, things were getting tougher and tougher for the resistance in South Africa, as the apartheid regime set about making racial hierarchy even more rigid. In December 1956, Ruth First was one of the 154 activists arrested for high treason. Others included her husband and prominent ANC figures like Mandela and Oliver Tambo. The 4-year-long treason trial which followed was a farce, which even the South African state had to give up on for lack of evidence. But things just kept getting worse. After the South African police murdered 69 anti-apartheid protesters at Sharpeville in 1960, a state of emergency was declared and the ANC was banned. In this grim context, Ruth First was arrested and imprisoned as the first white woman to be held without charge or legal advice for 3 months. Things were just too hot now. In March 1964, Ruth left South Africa and went with her 3 kids to England. Here, Ruth First began an academic career alongside her political work, researching the social structure and nature of apartheid as a system of control and exploitation. After spells in Manchester and Durham, this path eventually took her back to Southern Africa, where she was made research director of the Center for African Studies at the Eduardo Mondlane University of Maputo in Mozambique. In the meantime, the South African minority regime and their network set the goal to weaken and undermine the anti-apartheid movement around the world. No one was safe, no matter where. Ruth First, as one of the most formidable enemies of racial and class hierarchy in South Africa, received a parcel on the 17th August 1982, and similar to Mondlane got killed by the bomb that exploded when she opened it. The assassin was the notorious spy and killer Craig Williamson, who may also be behind the killing of Mozambique's president Samora Machel and Swedish ex-Prime Minister Olof Palme. Unfortunately, Ruth First did not live to see her home country freed from apartheid. But thanks to her work, South Africa was eventually able to shake off the shackles of the white minority regime. What would Ruth First say if she would see South Africa today? Could she have foreseen the challenges the country faces, such as land distribution, unemployment, gender-based violence, rampant poverty, climate change and crime? The thing that would probably annoy her the most is how the Revolutionary Alliance corrupted over time, and how South Africa is still firmly in the hands of a small minority, which are those who control the means of production. It was the South African revolutionary Chris Hani who foreshadowed the rot that was to infect most of the country's government. He once said in an interview, "What I fear is that the liberators emerge as elitists who drive around in Mercedes-Benzes and use the resources of this country to live in palaces and to gather riches." Just like Ruth First, also Hani did not live to see the apartheid regime defeated by the power of the people. Chris Hani was born in 1942 in Transkei, and his experiences of growing up under apartheid and witnessing the injustices inflicted upon black South Africans shaped his political views and led him to the anti-apartheid struggle. After his studies, he joined the ANC and took over the leading position of Umkhonto weSizwe, which translates to Spare of the Nation. This was the armed wing of the ANC, whose members believed that the apartheid system could not be brought down by civil disobedience alone. When Ruth First's widower, Joe Slovo, got sick, he also left Hani his position in the SACP. As he was a key strategist of his party and he strongly supported the armed struggle against the apartheid government, they developed a particular hatred for him. Yet, Hani was fearless. He was a non-racialist, a committed Marxist and a vocal advocate for democracy. He believed that the struggle against apartheid was not only a fight against racism, but also a fight for economic and social justice.
Capitalism has failed in the most catastrophic manner. It has been responsible for the most devastating wars: First World War, the Second World War. Capitalism has seen the most serious depression in the 30s, when millions of people lost their job. Equally, socialism is going through a turbulent period. It has collapsed virtually in a number of European countries. It is experiencing some serious traumas in the Soviet Union. For me, as a communist, I see this as temporary staleness, because the basic contradictions of any capitalist society remain: exploitation, class domination, poverty, and unemployment. And I believe workers will never accept capitalism as a solution.
He was critical of the neoliberal economic policies of the apartheid government and called for the nationalization of key industries and the redistribution of wealth. He said that socialism is not about big concepts and heavy theory. Socialism is about decent shelter for those who are homeless. It is about water for those who have no safe drinking water. It is about healthcare. It is about a life of dignity for the old. It is about overcoming the huge divide between urban and rural areas. It is about a decent education for all our people. In the beginning of the 1990s, people felt that apartheid is about to end, and Chris Hani and Nelson Mandela were the most popular leading figures in the ANC. Especially Hani had a great way when it came to addressing the people on the streets. Everyone was hopeful that with Mandela and Hani they had the right people to lead South Africa into the post-apartheid era. However, Hani had many enemies among the white conservatives. It was the South African politician and right-wing extremist Clive Derby Lewis who gave a gun, money, and a hit list to Janusz Walusz, a Polish racist and another right-wing extremist, to do the dirty work. The names on this list included Nelson Mandela, Joe Slovo, and Chris Hani. On the 10th April 1993, as Hani was in front of his house, he got shot and killed by Walusz, 1 year before the election and the end of apartheid in South Africa. More than 30 years have passed since the historic elections in April 1994 that brought the ANC to power. It is safe to say that although black South Africans are in a better place than they were under the apartheid system, they continue to harvest the grapes of wrath from a neoliberal system in which corruption and trickle-down economics continue to trap the overwhelming majority of the people in poverty. If Chris Hani would be alive today, he would be disgusted by the state of his parties, and he would tell them so. 3 years before Hani's assassination, Nelson Mandela visited Kenya, right after his release from prison in 1990. Here, he wanted to see the grave of the most iconic figure in the struggle for Kenya's independence, Dedan Kimathi. But Daniel Arap Moi, Kenya's president at that time, was embarrassed as he needed to admit that there was no grave. And even today in 2024, over 60 years after Kenya gained independence, there is still no grave for the leader of the Mau Mau who fought, lost and died in the fight for freedom. Dedan Kimathi was born in 1920 as part of a clan belonging to the Kikuyu, Kenya's largest ethnic group, which is concentrated mainly in the central part of the East African country. The Kenya in which Kimathi grew up was a powder keg. The British, who declared the region between Lake Victoria and the Indian Ocean a protectorate in 1895, expelled the Kikuyu, Kamba and Maasai people into reserves. The Europeans in Kenya wanted to turn the country into a settler state, like South Africa. In 1948, some 30,000 whites were living in luxury on the fertile Kenyan land of the dispossessed locals, against some 6 million natives. The locals who inherited the land from generation to generation were not only dispossessed but driven into poverty. They had no choice but to work as slaves or so-called squatters for the thieves who robbed them of the land. The mood became increasingly angry among the locals. However, their hatred was not only directed against the white settlers, no, it was also directed against the collaborators, the small privileged class of wealthy Kenyans who profited from the exploitation of their own people. When Kimathi was probably around 30 years old, he joined the Kenya African Union. This association, under its leader Jomo Kenyatta, was moderate in their quest for Kenya's independence. That was definitely too soft for Kimathi. He found a group within the KAU that was much more radical, which realized that cooperation on an equal level with the British exploiters is not possible. The Mau Mau. In order to join, Kimathi participated in a ceremony. A mysterious oath was said to make an invincible spirit warrior out of him. In 1952, the revolt escalated. The Mau Mau warriors stormed the British institutions and shot white settler families. Dedan Kimathi took the lead in coordinating the forest fights. Kimathi was aware of the Mau Mau's military inferiority, so he used guerrilla tactics against a superior opponent. In response, the British interned an estimated 150,000 people, mostly Kikuyu, civilians, in camps. Here they were subjected to terrible conditions. Many were tortured and raped. The British sent in troops from the other colonies and bombed the Mau Mau camps from planes. In 1956, Dedan Kimathi was captured. This marked the beginning of the end of the Forest War. Right before his execution, he said to his wife Mukami, "Now, if I must leave you and my family, I have nothing to regret about. My blood will water the tree of independence." 4 years later, the Mau Mau were finally defeated, and in 1963 Kenya gained independence. Jomo Kenyatta is pronounced first president, and his whole life he refused to give the Mau Mau their rightful place in the collective memory of Kenya. Kenyatta disdained the Mau Mau and Kimathi. He was worried they could overshadow him and even question his position, along with that of others who collaborated with the British. Even though Dedan Kimathi was killed by the British, by continuously postponing the search for his remains to properly bury him, he was killed again by the people who profited from his fight. That you don't have to be a radical like Kimathi in order to pose a threat to the status quo can be seen in the tragic fate of Burundi's first democratically elected president, Melchior Ndadaye. Ndadaye was born in 1953 in Rwanda, Urundi, which was a so-called trust territory of the United Nations. This region was once part of the German colonial empire and was later under Belgian military rule. It was in this period when the colonizers sought to impose their rule with a special divide and conquer strategy, which was to separate the people by putting emphasis on their ethnicities and attributing each ethnicity a certain set of characterizations, rights and privileges. The colonizers designated the Tutsi as their collaborator class, positioning them as the ruling elite who formally controlled the other ethnic groups, predominantly the Hutus. Ndadaye was a Hutu, and when he was around 10 years old, Rwanda-Urundi was split into Rwanda and Burundi, destined to coexist as fraternal twins bound by fate. Even after the colonizers left, the entrenched ethnic hierarchies remained. In Burundi, the Tutsis, holding a privileged position, were unwilling to share power. This tension culminated in 1972 with the Ikisa, or the Great Calamity, a series of mass killings committed by the Tutsi-dominated army and government against educated Hutus. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed in this genocide. As an educated Hutu himself, Ndadaye fled to Rwanda, where he studied and began his political engagement. Together with other Hutu exiles, he founded the UBU, a Marxist-Leninist political party. 3 years after he returned to Burundi, Burundi, he founded a new underground political movement in 1986 called Frodebu. When he criticized the government and its president, Pierre Buyoya, for the continued violent ethnic conflicts, he was imprisoned for 2 months. He needed to wait till 1991 for his party to finally be recognized. Ndadaye was a fresh wind in the political landscape of Burundi, as he viewed his country's society, whether Hutu or Tutsi, through the lens of social class, not tribes. In April 1993, he was nominated by his party as the presidential candidate for the first democratic elections of Burundi, where he rallied with the slogan New Burundi. Unlike the ruling party, he didn't try to get votes through sowing ethnic division. To everyone's surprise, Melchior Ndadaye won the elections and became not only Burundi's first democratically elected president in a country where the transfer of power had until then been synonymous with coups, more significantly, he became Burundi's first Hutu president since independence. This miracle, however, only lasted 3 months. The former president Buyoya and the Tutsi were shocked about the election results, as they thought they had a permanent grip to power, and also the elites of the neighboring countries were not amused, as it casted a bad light on them. A Hutu president, democratically elected by the people in a transparent election, they wanted to avoid this by all means. When Ndadaye began his presidency, he was cautious. He wanted to balance things by distributing the power fairly among the ethnicities. However, especially in the military, which was Tutsi-dominated, they feared for their positions. Right after celebrating his first 100 days in office, Melchior Ndadaye was cold-bloodedly killed on the 21st October 1993. He paid the ultimate price, his life, for the ethnic divisions in Burundi that had come to dominate all other political considerations, and his death was to plunge the nation into civil war that would last till 2005. Someone who arranges their own tombstone inscription at the age of 60 must have been aware that their life could end at any time. Hero of war and peace. He lived for the cause of peace. He died for his principles and values, it says on the stone. Anwar Sadat, who described himself in this way, underwent a drastic change in perception in Egypt, the Arab world and the entire globe. Initially a national hero, then allegedly a traitor, first a warmonger, then a peacemaker, at times a hero, then a villain. Anwar Sadat was born in 1918 in the Sultanate of Egypt. At the military academy, he became friends with Gamal Abdel Nasser. Both were part of the secret society of free officers who aimed for Egypt's independence from Great Britain. Together with other revolutionary officers, they overthrew the corrupt King Farouk in 1952. Sadat was assigned to announce the news of the revolution to the Egyptian people over the radio networks, and was serving in the role of vice president as the loyal right hand to Nasser, who became president of Egypt. Sadat was also the one to announce Nasser's death in 1970, and himself was to be the new president. In terms of charisma, it was impossible for Sadat to compete with Nasser, who was far more than just the president of Egypt, since he had nationalized the Suez Canal in 1956, thereby defying the colonial powers Great Britain and France. He had become a national hero in the Arab world. No one expected much change from Sadat, as they saw him as Nasser's puppet. Actually, the leading military figures would have loved things to continue in the Nasser way, with an easily to manipulate president, but Sadat was to surprise them all. He started a purge, the so-called corrective revolution, and dismissed and even imprisoned many high-ranking figures in the regime who had close ties with the Soviet Union. He expelled the Soviet military advisors and reformed the Egyptian military to prepare for a confrontation with Israel. He introduced a capitalist policy for Egypt with his Infitah policy after it had been a socialist state under Nasser. Actually, he changed everything that people were used to. His decision to encourage the emergence of an Islamist movement, which had been suppressed by Nasser, was to prove fatal for him. Sadat himself was a Muslim and wanted, by releasing the Muslim brothers who had been convicted under Nasser, to create a social balance to the leftist forces in the country. It would soon become apparent that the Muslim brothers were far less loyal than Sadat had hoped. However, initially Sadat wanted to show his Arab neighboring states that he was a worthy successor to Nasser. Thus, on Yom Kippur in October 1973, he ordered a surprise attack on Israel to reclaim the Sinai Peninsula, which had been occupied for 6 years. He achieved what was believed to be impossible. The Egyptian military advanced approximately 15 kilometers into the occupied Sinai Peninsula after penetrating and largely destroying the Bar-Lev line, which was thought to be impregnable. Even though Egypt didn't win the war, from then on Sadat was known as the hero of the crossing. And then again, he did something no one expected. A few years later, Sadat reached out to the government in Jerusalem with a call to end the state of war and establish peace in the Arab-Israeli conflict. In November 1977, Anwar Sadat spoke as the first Arab head of state before the Israeli parliament, the Knesset. Egypt recognized the right of the Jewish state to exist, and in return received the Sinai back, entirely according to the formula Land for Peace. Sadat and his Israeli counterpart Menachem Begin were honored with the Nobel Peace Prize for this, but the Arab world reacted with rejection. The handshake with Israel was perceived as a punch against Palestine's desire for self-determination and as a betrayal of the idea of Arab unity represented by Nasser. 2 years after the Camp David Accords on October 6, 1981, Sadat attended the annual victory parade in Cairo to celebrate Egypt's crossing of the Suez Canal. Now, his own policies would lead to his downfall. Unlike Nasser, he had allowed Islam greater space in the country. That he had recently imprisoned radical Islamists hardly helped. The damage was done. During the parade, Anwar Sadat was assassinated by an Islamist fanatic. Sadat was a champion at making enemies, and thus his legacy in Egypt remains controversial to this day. Although he described himself fittingly in his tombstone inscription, Anwar Sadat is still not accorded the recognition he deserves. The idea that Africa's wealth of resources has been more of a curse than a blessing due to centuries of exploitation is particularly evident in the fate of Ken Saro-Wiwa. Ken Saro-Wiwa was called many things: a Nigerian patriot, an Ogoni nationalist, the father of the African environmental movement, a writer, a poet, essayist, playwright, publisher, television producer, and he was also called a murderer. As such, he was sentenced to death by hanging by the Nigerian government on November 10, 1995, and executed. What did Saro-Wiwa do to deserve death? How did he come to be in this position? Born in 1941 in Nigeria, Ken Saro-Wiwa was traumatized by the Biafra War and worked as a young man in Bonny, a major oil export port in the Niger Delta. Yet the experiences of the war haunted him. He processed the chaos, the division of the country and his people, the Ogoni, in his books. He founded his own publishing house and became perhaps the most prolific author in Africa in less than 2 decades. Just as he could not close his eyes to the injustices of the war, Saro-Wiwa could not accept how oil wealth corrupted and destroyed an entire society. He vowed to dedicate his life to fighting all corruption. As an Ogoni, Saro-Wiwa belonged to one of the smaller minorities in the country. The large oil and natural gas deposits in their land made the Ogoni pawns in the game of oil companies. Unfortunately, the Nigerian government was all too often an accomplice in the environmentally destructive, health-damaging and criminal actions of the oil companies in Ogoni land. The pipelines, often rusty and leaking, ran through village centers and family properties and over fields, exploded repeatedly and claimed many victims. Meanwhile, the people could only watch helplessly as their rivers and farmland were polluted and rendered unusable. Saro-Wiwa wanted to make it clear to people that they needed to raise their voices and demand their rights. As a committed author, he used his voice to highlight the exploitation by oil companies, the plight of ethnic minorities in Nigeria, and environmental destruction. He wrote about the idea of a federal Nigeria and how its realization was thwarted by military dictators. In his short story Africa Kills Her Son from 1989, he writes about a society where the honest are punished while the deceitful and corrupt are rewarded. In every facet of our life, theft is the foundation of all things. For Saro-Wiwa, the people of Nigeria, especially the Ogoni, are prisoners in their own country, captives of the Royal Dutch Shell Oil Corporation and the Nigerian government. The oil wealth should have brought them freedom, but instead it has led them to ruin. Saro-Wiwa saw how his people were suffering under the oil industry and accused the oil corporations and the government of genocide against the Ogoni. He wrote books, founded a civil rights organization, and organized protest marches. In his resolution, it states, "We call on Shell, Chevron, and the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation to pay compensation for environmental destruction and for unpaid leaves." Both Shell and the new dictator, General Sani Abacha, found the increased attention and civil disobedience too much. Saro-Wiwa was arrested and harassed several times without cause. In May 1994, it happened. 4 Ogoni chiefs, who were part of the civil rights movement but opposed to Saro-Wiwa's approach, were brutally murdered. Whoever was responsible, it was an opportunity to get rid of the troublemaker. Saro-Wiwa, along with 8 other representatives of the movement, were arrested as the culprits. The whole world watched as these Ogoni 9 were sentenced to death by hanging in a show trial. Later, alleged witnesses of the act would recant their statements and confess that they were bribed by the Nigerian government with promises of jobs from the Royal Dutch Shell Oil Corporation for their false testimonies. Over a year later, Ken Saro-Wiwa and 8 others were executed on the dictator's orders despite global protests. Saro-Wiwa managed to show the world that oil corporations will stop at nothing when it comes to profit. His last words shortly before his death were, "Lord, take my soul, but the struggle continues." Coming to our last assassinated African leader, I admit he's an obvious outlier, and you may say he doesn't belong on this list, because he's not African. However, I decided that he rightly belongs here. I claim Malcolm X for Africa. Why actually not? After all, he claimed Africa for Black Americans when he sought solidarity with Kenyans, Ghanaians, and Tanzanians before his assassination in 1965.
We are African, and we happen to be in America. We're not American. We are people who formerly were Africans who were kidnapped and brought to America.
Also, Malcolm X made at least 4 trips to Africa, where he recognized the interconnectedness of struggles against oppression and injustice globally by saying, as long as we think that we should get Mississippi straightened out before we worry about the Congo, we will never get Mississippi straightened out. With that, he implied that the fight for civil rights in America is linked to the fight against imperialism and colonial exploitation in Africa and elsewhere. The idea is that oppression anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. When he was in Nigeria, the people there gave him the name Omowale, which means in Yoruba, the child has returned. Malcolm X changed in Africa, and what he learned here widened his political views, because soon after his return to America, he gave a speech drawing parallels between European colonial rule and institutionalized racism in the US. The police in Harlem were like the French in Algeria, like an occupying army, and for the first time he publicly made the connection between racial oppression and capitalism. After his last trip to Africa in 1964, he met with Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, with Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, with Maya Angelou in Ghana, and many more. And he concluded that the struggle of the Afro-Americans is connected with the struggle of all the oppressed people in the world, and that they all have to unite in order to face the fight against the exploiters. For a long time, Malcolm X had a radical stance as the leader of the Black Power movement, which was based on militancy, separatism, and resistance against whites. After his separation from the Nation of Islam, his visit in Africa, and his Hajj to Mecca, his ideas were way less fanatical, more tolerant. He was more willing to compromise in order to unite all the oppressed people. He no longer ruled out a coalition with liberal whites and more moderate representatives of the civil rights movement. And here it gets interesting, because as long as he was the angriest man of the USA, as they like to call him, unable to collaborate with the other movements, he was tolerated, as he was not yet hitting the nerve. Yes, he was always a troublemaker, but it was just when he started to become more political and aimed for a wide collaboration of multiple movements that he became really dangerous for the status quo. At the end of his life, Malcolm X declared that he was no longer just fighting for the rights of black people, but for human rights. He and Martin Luther King met only briefly once. Had they both lived longer, who knows what their alliance could have achieved. On the 21st February 1965, Malcolm X died when assassins of the Nation of Islam fired 21 shots at him during a lecture in New York. 3 years later, Martin Luther King was also shot dead in an assassination attempt in Memphis. In an interview, Malcolm X was once asked by a reporter,
"Are you not, perhaps, afraid of what might happen to you as a result of making these revelations?"
Oh, yeah. I probably am a dead man already.
Thank you for watching. That was the second part of Assassinated African Leaders. I hope you enjoyed it as much as such topic is enjoyable. Please leave a comment, a like, and subscribe.